An emerging writer sort of makes me feel like one of those cicadas that's dormant for all those years and then comes out and makes a big noise for a couple of days before it kicks off. And I guess I have to thank Helen and the Diaspora Dialogues for giving me a chance to speak, and Joe Kerz for making sure that hopefully it's intelligent. This story is called My Walk with Sin. It was our landlady, Mrs. Snyderman, who gave me the quarter. "You keep, Teresa," she said, rolling my fingers over the coin I held out to her. "You save for special." I stared at her through a haze of happiness, only slightly tinged with guilt. Guilt because I had watched that quarter fall from her purse, watched her walk away, stayed silent until my conscience pricked. It whispered, "Sin." Sin was on my mind a lot that year because I was going to make my first communion, and I didn't want anything to spoil it. My mother was already making my dress. "I'm almost finished the buttonholes," she said after working far into the night. "When it's done, it will have lace here and here," and she pointed to the sleeves and the neckline. "And I'll make a headband with flowers to hold the veil. It will be beautiful." "Can I try it on, please?" I begged time and time again. And sometimes my mother smiled, and I stretched my arms to let the filmy fabric drift down around me. I couldn't wait to wear it. Trouble was, I knew that to wear the dress I had to be sin-free, and my soul had to be as pure and white as my dress. I couldn't pick up Mrs. Snyderman's quarter and walk away. "Mrs. Snyderman," I called, you dropped this." She heard. And then, just as if God wanted to prove that good deeds are rewarded, I had a quarter of my own. "Thank you," I whispered, and Mrs. Snyderman's apple doll face lifted into a happy smile. Quarters were rare at our house. My parents had been counting pennies ever since we arrived in Canada. I knew. I heard their hissing whispers from the kitchen every Friday when they thought I was asleep. Even with the blanket pulled over my head, their sharp sounds skidded into my ears. I heard their worried mumbles as they planned for food and rent and streetcar fare for the week to come. There never seemed to be enough. There were certainly never extra quarters for me. "You save for special," Mrs. Snyderman had said before she walked away. Well, I didn't have to think about special. There couldn't be anything more special than the Saturday afternoon matinee at the Victory Theater on Spadina Avenue. I had never been, and I wanted to see for myself. For weeks, my best friend Lucy had been telling me about the Saturday matinee. "My mom lets me go every Saturday, and they sell popcorn and soda pop and everything," she told me. And she always finished with a sigh. "Oh, it's too bad you can't come." I thought it was too bad too, but I knew there was no point in asking. Even if we had the money, I was afraid my mother wouldn't let me go. I was afraid she'd say, "It's such a big city, full of strangers. Stay close to home." Lucy and I were both 8 that year, but she was smaller and more delicate than I was. People noticed Lucy. I think it was her eyes. They were blue like mine, but there was something about hers that made grown-ups stare and then look away when she stared back. Mrs. Snyderman didn't like her. "You have to watch that girl," she told a neighbor who came to buy tea towels from the stand of linen set up on the lawn in front of our house. "A Rumlaufer, a street urchin, you cannot trust." Her words carried to where Lucy and I were playing jacks on the sidewalk. I watched Lucy stiffen. I heard her suck a long breath of air between her teeth. "You can too trust her," I called, jumping to my feet. "She's my friend, I should know." Mrs. Snyderman pinched her lips into a tight line and shook her finger at me. I knew that if she told my mother, I'd be spanked. Lucy looked at me. Then she turned her blue-eyed stare on Mrs. Snyderman until the landlady muttered and turned away. On our good days, Lucy and I collected boxes and turned her porch into castles, or we lugged out blankets and made tents, and we wrapped ourselves in fabric. "You're the Red Queen and I'm the Yellow Queen," she'd announce, and she'd lead a promenade along the sidewalk. Our parades were always followed by a grand ball because Lucy loved to dance. "Do it like this," she would say, holding her chin high and lifting her hands and feet gracefully as she twirled. "That's the way my mother does it." I struggled to imitate her light steps. On our bad days, we couldn't agree on anything. "It's my turn to go first," I'd insist. "You don't do it right," Lucy would complain. "You're bossy," I'd shout back, and we'd stomp off to play alone. But playing alone was lonely, so it was never long before one of us came to make up. Lucy's mother seemed younger than all the other mothers on the street. Maybe it was the bright dresses and the strappy shoes she wore. Maybe it was her hair which fell to her shoulders. It was never hidden under a dark kerchief. Lucy's mother didn't stand in whispering huddles with the other mothers. I watched them frown and turn away when she walked by. I saw the men follow her with their eyes. When she smiled, the only mother who smiled back was mine. Sometimes we played on the lawn, and she showed us how to turn cartwheels and spin without getting dizzy. She laughed and clapped her hands when we danced for her. Sometimes she slept all day. "Is she sick?" I asked, worried. "My mother never slept in the daytime." "Just tired," Lucy said. "She worked late last night. Let's play at your house." One evening I was drying the supper dishes as my mother and Mrs. Snyderman drank tea at the kitchen table. "There is no father," Mrs. Snyderman whispered. "The mother? I don't know. I think maybe she..." And she leaned towards my mother so I couldn't hear. "Her mother's a dancer," I said. "A dancer?" Mrs. Snyderman snorted, and I saw her raise her eyebrows over the rim of her teacup. Mama frowned at me, and I blushed because I knew it was wrong to interrupt grown-ups. Then she sighed, and I heard her say, "It's a hard life for a woman alone, without a husband. A child needs the guidance of two parents." And right then I decided I could teach Lucy everything that my parents taught me. "Mama says you have to look people in the eye and say good morning," I instructed. "If you are polite, Mrs. Snyderman will like you." Lucy didn't appreciate my wisdom. "What does your mama know anyway?" she shouted. "I don't care if that stupid Tepsy likes me or not." "My mother knows everything," I shouted back, "and you shouldn't call people names." "Like you never call anybody names?" she shouted over her shoulder as she stomped away. Lucy was right. I sometimes giggled and mimicked Mrs. Snyderman too. It was hard to resist when she kept talking about Tepsi-Colas. We weren't mad for long. An hour later, we were playing again. One day, Lucy had a plan to steal a chocolate bar from Mr. Haber's store. The display of candies at the front of his counter was a dreadful temptation, so I agreed. But when it came time to carry out her plan, my fear of sin took over. "You're useless," Lucy hissed at me when we were alone. "All you had to do was pick up a bar of soap and say, 'How much?' That's all. How much?" Well, I said how much. "Yeah, but you were looking at me, so of course Mr. Haber was looking at me too. How can I take a chocolate bar with old owl eyes staring right at me?" "Mama says it's a sin to steal." "A sin? Why are you worrying about sins? You weren't going to steal anything. I was." "Well, so it's a sin for you too." "Teresa, you are so stupid. Of course it's a sin for me too, but I've made my first communion, and I don't have to worry about sins anymore. I go to confession, and Father Keller makes them go away." I was shocked. "But God knows," I huffed, and this time I stomped away. "I didn't really want a chocolate bar anyway," Lucy called, but I ignored her, and we didn't talk for the rest of the day. When we made up, Lucy said, "They're showing 2 films and 3 cartoons at the Victory on Saturday. Too bad you can't come." "Oh, but I can," I said, thinking of Mrs. Snyderman's quarter. I spoke quickly, but I knew there was an obstacle. I had to ask for permission. I'm going out to play with Lucy," I told my mother as she washed the kitchen floor. She sat back on her heels and looked up at me. "Supper's at 5, she said. brushing hair from her forehead with the back of her hand. "Don't be late." And my heart sank as I watched her rinse out the rag and lean forward to wash a new section of linoleum. "It's not really a lie," I kept telling myself as we ran towards the theater. "I am playing with Lucy." But the heavy weight of guilt stayed on my chest, and I knew that I had another sin to add to my already lengthy list. And Teresa adds a few more sins to her list and runs into a few more hardships before her communion day. And those of you who know a little bit about the history of Toronto know that the Victory Theatre turned into the Victory Burlesque House. Thank you.